Over the last couple of hours, the United States and NATO have each provided the Russians with the response the Russians have asked for, the written response the Russians have asked for to the Russian demands made a few weeks ago for an end to the eastward expansion of NATO and for the dismantling of NATO's infrastructure in Eastern Europe. As predicted, as universally expected, the United States and NATO have said that they have rejected Russia's demand that NATO close its door to new members, that it, in other words, abjure its policy of admitting new members and revert to the position which had been agreed at the time when the Soviet Union broke up in discussions between the Soviets and the United States and other NATO powers, discussions which led to verbal promises from a variety of US and European officials that NATO would not move eastwards beyond the German border. So the Western powers, the United States and NATO, have formally rejected this Russian demand. They repeat again that the open door, NATO's open door, remains sacrosanct. Now, as I said, I don't think anybody would have expected otherwise, and it is inconceivable that the Russians expected otherwise. But I would say that, contrary to some of the claims, things are not perhaps quite as clear-cut as this rejection seems to imply, because in a press conference that Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, gave at the State Department, a press conference which incidentally was far more temperate in its language, far more moderate in its tone than some of the earlier press conferences that Tony Blinken has indulged himself in over the last few weeks. He did actually seem to leave the door about this NATO open door policy somewhat ajar for further discussions. And it's quite interesting to note precisely what he said, and I want to be very careful now not to overinterpret his words. It could be that his words were just off the cuff and weren't intended to mean anything, or it could be that they mean more than they seem. He was asked the question, there is no change in the US and NATO position in this document that, and then Blinken cut in, first of all, there is no change, there will be no change. Second, we reiterate that principle. Of course, it is for NATO, not the United States unilaterally, to discuss the open door policy. These are decisions that NATO makes as an alliance, not the United States unilaterally. But from our perspective, I can't be more clear. NATO's door is open, remains open, and that is our commitment. Note those words. It is for NATO, not the United States, unilaterally to discuss the open door policy. These are decisions that NATO makes as an alliance, not the United States, unilaterally. Now that does, it seems to me, at least leave the door ajar for future discussions on this issue between Russia and NATO, in other words, between Russia and the NATO alliance taken together, as opposed to Russia and the United States bilaterally. Now, as I said, I want to reiterate again, I may be over-interpreting, over-analysing these words, but in and of themselves, they seem to me clear enough, and I'm sure that the Russians will have taken note of them, just as they will have taken note of the much more temperate, much more moderate language of the press conference. And of course the Russians have said that the documents that they have received don't remotely address their core issue. But again, it seemed to me that Lavrov's words in response were rather more moderate than might have been expected from him, and it may be, given that he's leaving open also the possibility for further discussions, that more is going on behind the scenes than we actually know. And it could be, I want to stress, I'm not certain of this, it could be that there have been discussions within NATO, between NATO member states, between, for example, the United States, France and Germany, with the French and the Germans saying, well, look, we're never going to admit Ukraine into the alliance. Why then create a crisis over this non-issue? It could be that there's been some pushback to this doctrinaire NATO position, US position on this open door policy, and it could be that at some point, as part of some kind of negotiation between NATO and Russia, we could see some kind of commitment or understanding or legally binding agreement, as the Russians insist, which essentially and effectively closes NATO's door. For the rest, what was really striking about Blinken's comments, apart from the fact that, as I said, it was all much more low-key than before, is that there was less of the flesh-creeping talk about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are known to be extremely unhappy about all of this, and there's been words about the very great damage all of this is doing to the Ukrainian economy. And Blinken admitted that Ukraine's economy is now coming under extreme pressure. And he said that the United States and its allies are trying to find some means of assisting Ukraine. And he said the following: we're looking to support our allies and partners in dealing with the secondary negative consequences of Russia's destabilizing acts. We know that Ukraine's economy and financial position is being affected by the crisis, and just as we're bolstering Ukraine's security, so we are looking for how we can support its economy beyond the significant assistance we're already providing. Our European allies and partners are doing so as well, and that's another matter we'll have an opportunity to discuss with Congress later this afternoon. We don't know what the discussions are, what the agreements are, but it is an acknowledgement that Ukraine's economy is coming under severe pressure. And by the way, a journalist put it even more starkly. He actually said that Ukraine's economy is crumbling, that the situation, that the stress that Ukraine is coming under is putting Ukraine under severe pressure. This was the question. Meanwhile, that's to say the Russians, are destabilizing Ukraine from within. The economy's crumbling. You're spending hundreds of millions of dollars shoring them up. At what point do you stop playing Russia's game and to take preemptive action? An admission from the journalist that the Russians hold the initiative in this matter, though, as I said, the kind of preemptive action that we're talking about is apparently something that's been ruled out by the Europeans. So a fact which certainly the media in Britain are not reporting about how Ukraine's economy is coming under severe stress, but an admission of this by the United States. Now, there is a bizarre paradox to all of this issue, which is, as I said before, we're now getting more and more analysis of the photographic data, the satellite photographs that the United States has been waving around, and which is supposed to prove the existence of this great Russian build-up in European Russia. It's important at this point again to reiterate that the Russians up to now have made no threat to invade or attack Ukraine. They have instead continuously and persistently denied that they have any intention of doing so. And it is entirely the Western powers, or to be more precise, the United States and Britain, that have been relentlessly talking up the story of an imminent Russian attack on Ukraine, something which is causing increasing alarm and confusion and dismay in European capitals, notably in Berlin, Paris and Rome, and which has caused utter dismay in Kiev, where, as I said, the economy is now tanking or crumbling, in the words of that journalist. So why has this happened? Why have we got ourselves into this situation? This is the big mystery. Why is the United States talking up the story? And is it true that the Russian military in European Russia is poised to strike on Ukraine? Well, there's now been analysis of some of these satellite photos, and a particularly good one on the Moon of Alabama blog. And the Moon of Alabama, the person who writes there, I gather, is called Bernhardt, has pointed out that the photographs, the satellite photographs that the United States has been circulating, have in fact been carefully cropped. They give the impression that Russian tanks and armoured vehicles and lorries and military equipment are being deployed in open fields in Russia in the middle of winter, but never mind, that they've been deployed in the open air, poised to strike against Ukraine at a moment's notice. Well, Bernhardt, as I will call him, who's skilled at this kind of thing, has done some analysis of the photos, and he's pointed out that they've all been cropped, and that in fact, far from these tanks and armoured vehicles being parked in open fields, they're actually parked alongside permanent barracks. In other words, at permanent local positions, the permanent positions of the Russian military. Far from Russian soldiers being out there shivering in the cold, in the fields, they are warm in their beds in barracks, except of course when they're exercising, which, by the way, in the Russian military apparently happens on a near continuous basis. The Russian military, most of whose maneuver groups are now made up, by the way, of professional soldiers, not conscripts, apparently trains on an almost continuous cycle, in contrast to many of the militaries in NATO, and I believe many of the militaries in the large parts of the military of the United States itself. So it's simply not true that these troops, these Russian troops, are out there in the open air. What has been happening, and I've discussed this extensively in previous programs, is that there has been a steady incremental build-up by the Russians of permanent military bases and facilities in European Russia. Military formations, which had already been positioned there before the crisis last April, have been beefed up. Barracks have been extended. Logistical depots are being created. And in some cases, entirely new formations, much more expanded formations, have been formed on the basis of smaller old ones. In other words, there is a steady incremental Russian military build-up in European Russia, but it does not take quite the form that some of the fevered military commentary, the commentary you've been reading in the Western media would suggest. And all these photos that the United States has been circulating around over the last few weeks have been cropped in order to make that fact invisible. In other words, in order to conceal this fact. And it's been striking that the CIA director, William Burns, has been going around Europe, shopping his wares, showing everybody these cropped photos, showing them to people in Berlin and Paris and no doubt in Brussels. He was also apparently in Kiev and meeting with general bafflement because, of course, nowadays It's no longer the case that the United States within NATO has unique access to satellite pictures, as was the case during the Cold War. Today, most of the big NATO powers have their own satellite gathering facilities, and of course they can also consult Google Earth, which is what I understand Bernhard has done. So they're able to look at these photos and compare them with their own data and realize that these photos have been cropped and that they don't show what they purport to show. And that, no doubt, partly explains the rifts that we've been seeing growing within NATO over the last few days. Or for the last few weeks. So why did the US start this whole campaign? Well, I'm going to make a guess. I mean, I'm still very uncertain about this. I think at some level, maybe the intention was to manufacture some kind of crisis in which Biden could be presented as the new JFK to bolster his poll ratings. But I suspect that the mystery here is the formation of the new German government. The answer to this mystery is the formation of the new German government in the spring. There's a great deal of excitement in parts of the Western media and in what you might call the Atlanticist community, Britain and the United States specifically, that some members of this new government, the Green ministers, Annalena Baerbock, who is of course the foreign minister, and Robert Habeck, who is the new economy minister, have previously taken rigidly Atlanticist and anti-Russian positions. And it seems to me that there might have been an attempt, a concerted attempt, to bounce the Germans into taking a much harder line against the Russians than the previous German government under Angela Merkel was willing to do, and to get the Germans to harden up their position against the Russians on all sorts of issues. And it's clear that if so, this project has miscarried. We have seen both Annalena Baerbock and Robert Habeck actually continuing to stick to what has become established German policy of engagement with Russia. Baerbock went to Moscow, where she seems to have had a fairly friendly meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and it seems that Habeck has made it clear that he opposes any move by the US and the NATO powers that would result in a cut-off of gas supplies by Russia to Europe. So far from the German position bending, it remains pretty much as always. And there has been, as a result, an extraordinary media campaign against Germany in parts of the Anglo-American press. It's been astonishing to see the anger and vituperation directed against Germany, almost greater than the anger and vituperation directed against Russia that has resulted from this German decision to stick to existing German policies. There's been article after article, articles in the Wall Street Journal about how Germany's alliance with the United States is now in question. Articles in an editorial today in the Financial Times that the Western response needs Germany and that Germany isn't doing enough and isn't walking up to the plate. And it's clear that there is enormous disappointment amongst the Atlanticist community at the fact that Germany isn't taking the hard line that some people had hoped that it would after the new government was formed. And of course, it's also the case that there's probably annoyance that the fact that the Germans seem to have the backing of other big European states like France and Italy in the position that they're taking. So an attempt a possible attempt to push a new, inexperienced German government into taking a hard anti-Russian line has backfired. It's solidified doubts in Europe about the US administration, and it's highlighted the differences between the core European states, Germany, France, Italy, and the Anglo-Americans in a way that perhaps was unexpected. Anyway, that's a theory. I'm not going to claim that it's fact. It's very difficult to understand much of the thinking within the United States and in Washington and London over this issue. But as I said at the start of this program, it does seem to me as if Blinken, the US, is trying to leave the door slightly ajar to discussions with Russia, accepting that perhaps NATO might one day negotiate about its open door policy, even if the United States unilaterally can't do. We'll see what comes of that and whether that's meaningful in any way. Anyway, for their part, the Russians are reviewing their position. There was a long 8-hour discussion in Paris of the Normandy 4 group, of the political advisors of the Normandy 4 group. That includes Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. This is not a negotiation about the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. It is rather an attempt to set up some kind of summit meeting eventually of the leaders of these countries who are supposed to supervise that essential settlement, which under the Minsk agreement is supposed to take the form of direct negotiations between Ukraine and the leaders of the two Donbass republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And that discussion apparently lasted for 8 hours, but the word seems to be that the French are now applying heavy pressure on the Ukrainians to get them to start to carry through on some of their previous commitments that they made back in 2019 to implement the ceasefire along the contact line, to withdraw some of their artillery and heavy weapons, to stop some of their shelling and all the rest. And in return, the Russians are supposed to facilitate an exchange of prisoners or something along those lines. The discussions went on for 8 hours. The Russians have said that they were tough but straightforward, and that may be a good sign. And it seems that Macron is due to hold a long discussion with Putin tomorrow. We don't know whether it be a telephone call or a virtual meeting, but it could be that the Germans and the French, having peered down the abyss, might be preparing to take some measures to get the negotiations over Ukraine unblocked. For their part, the Russians have used the fact that weapons have been sent to Ukraine by the Americans as the British to float the possibility that they might start to provide arms openly. Of course, they've been doing it for a long time, covertly, to the Donbass militia. They've claimed or pretended up to now that they've not provided direct military assistance to the Donbass, the militia in the Donbass. There is now a move by some Russian MPs to try to make that open, and of course that could result in various weapon systems being provided to the militia, one of which could be systems to counter these Turkish drones, which the Ukrainians are supplying to Ukraine. So that could involve delivery of weapon systems like the Panzer anti-aircraft and anti-drone gun and missile system, which is said to be very effective against drones. Some perhaps new radar sets to help the militia track these drones, and perhaps additional systems that the Russians are known to have developed to counter the effect of these Javelin anti-tank missiles that the United States and perhaps Britain have been delivering, these anti-tank systems, which, however, the Russians have said they are not in themselves particularly concerned about. So it could be that all of these moves are being taking place to balance the respective military positions as part of a general discussion between the Germans and the French and the Russians, with a view to getting eventually some kind of settlement process going. The obstacles in the face of that are going to be enormous, and we will see whether that happens. But it could be, as I said, that having peered down the abyss, the Germans and the French are prepared to go that extra mile and start to do that which up to now they have refused to do ever since the Minsk agreements were actually agreed back in February 2015. So a slightly calmer mood at the moment, still a tense situation. Perhaps the door to Russian demands, the Russian demands for an end to NATO eastward expansion, slightly ajar. Again, I want to stress again, I don't want to overinterpret Blinken's words, but apparently the Russians are going to prepare their own response to the NATO response and the US response to their demands. And the word in Moscow is that they're going to discuss this, that the Russians are going to discuss this with China, emphasizing the fact that China is now a de facto ally, and that the Russians will now start to work further towards taking their military technical countermeasures, which, as I've said on previous occasions, I'm fairly sure will take the form of deployment of some of these new military systems we've been hearing so much about. Anyway, that, it seems to me, is a roughly accurate summary of where we are. It's still, it seems to me, a very tense situation, a situation which has become tense as a result of the general hysteria we have seen pouring out of Washington and London over the last few weeks. It seems that the Germans, the French, the Italians are unhappy. The Ukrainians are open about how unhappy they are. There are problems with the Ukrainian economy, which I'm going to come to in another program. There are problems, by the way, with the general energy situation in Europe, which it is clear, as I discussed in my long video yesterday, the United States has no real response to. And the situation is far from resolved, but perhaps, as I said, we've just entered a period when the ships of diplomacy and war have entered into slightly calmer waters. That's enough from me today. More from me soon on all these topics. I look forward to you joining me both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, Alex Christoforou, and you'll find links, by the way, under this video. Remember to join us on Locals, where we have our new platform and where I did yesterday an absolutely gigantic live stream, as I now do every Wednesday, covering the various topics that get discussed every week and answering questions. I hope in a rather more, shall we say, straightforward way than Tony Blinken does. But anyway, if you want to engage with me, you can join us on Locals and participate in those live streams. And of course, we're also available on multiple other platforms now, on BitChute, Library, Rumble, SuperU, ODYSEE, and all the rest. And of course, you could support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star. and by coming to our shop, where you can buy, by the way, amazing things like amazing t-shirts and sweatshirts and hoodies and hats. We've Alex Christoforou made a decision. He's in overall charge of the shop to buy, to produce, to sell on that shop items of exceptional quality, and the feedback we get from our viewers who buy them is, extremely positive. I mean, I should say actually entirely positive about the quality of the things you will find in our shops. And of course, you can also get our famous magic mugs, including our new Good Day magic mug. And you can support us also by ticking the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and by checking your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a great day, a good day until then.